What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen gets utterly destroyed playing the King's Indian defense as black against Jeffrey Xiong, and this game was insane. I mean, when I first saw this game, I felt like I was watching Goku do a 4x Kaioken against Vegeta to save planet Earth. I was just completely shocked. Time for... Now, in the game, Jeffrey Xiong is playing as white. He opens 1d4, and of course, Magnus Carlsen goes straight for the King's Indian defense with g6, and then bishop to g7, allowing white to gain the center with the move e4. Now, the King's Indian defense is a very sharp opening. Black gives up the center to white, but of course, this was a Chess.com titled Tuesday Blitz game, and Magnus Carlsen, he just wanted to mix things up against his lower-rated opponent. Now, from here, white has a wide range of ideas, and in the game, he goes for my personal favorite variation against the King's Indian defense. That is the one where you go bishop to e2 and then bishop to e3 next, getting those bishops on the e-file. Now, this is one of the most popular and strongest variations against the King's Indian defense today, and it is unbelievably good for white. And in case you're not familiar, here's a quick rundown of why this one is so good. Here, if black goes c5, white just responds d5, and it gets a good version of a Benini structure. Now, on the other hand, if black plays the classical King's Indian defense move e5, then white's going to go d5 and use the very simple caveman style idea of just pushing that h-pawn all the way down the board, potentially even to the h6 square, trying to lock that bishop on g7 out of the game forever. Now, of course, beyond c5 and e5, black does have some other options. However, if black does not play c5 or e5, white's just going to have a good version of a weird sideline in the King's Indian. So, for example, if black plays, I don't know, a5 or knight to d7, then knight f3 from white is just terrific. Now, in the game, Magnus, he mixes things up and goes for a different idea. That is simply knight to c6. Now, immediately, this knight is causing massive problems in the white position. Black wants to go e5 next, and then if white goes d5, then he gets the knight to the wonderful e7 square. That is typical for the Mar del Plata variation of the King's Indian, and things would get ultra sharp. Now, of course, white still has some ideas here, and in the game, Jeffrey goes d5, hitting the knight jumps to the e5 square. So far, this is all theory, and now Jeffrey plays the strong move f2 to f4, simply hitting the knight. Where the heck is the knight going to go? Now, from here, the main move, at least according to theory, is going to be the move knight e to g4. The idea is that knight does put pressure on the bishop on the e3 square. The bishop has to go somewhere. Typically, it goes to the d2 square. And from here, both sides have a lot of options. There are a lot of cool lines, or white gets some sort of weird attack on the Kingside with the move g4, threatening g5. These lines are ultra sharp. Now, instead of this, here Magnus Carlsen on move 8, instead of going knight to g4, he actually retreats his knight to the other square on d7. Now, this is a bit of a surprise. This move is not nearly as active as knight to g4, but Magnus Carlsen, his goal in this game is to throw his opponent a curveball, and let's see how he backs it up. Now, here, Jeffrey Xiong, his next priority is going to be developing the knight to either f3 or h3 and then short castles, and it turns out both f3 and h3 are very good squares for the knight. In the game, he goes knight to f3. However, knight to h3 is also very playable. The idea is you want to follow up knight to f2, and that knight on the f2 square actually does a fantastic job of supporting the pawns in the center. Perhaps white will go g4 later. I mean, it's a very interesting line, but instead, knight to f3 played in the game. Very solid move, and now Magnus, he counterattacks in the center with the move e6. Now, this is already a critical position for white. If you do nothing, let's say you just castle on the Kingside, ignoring black's threat, then black is simply going to take on the d5 square, and after white recaptures, then rook e8 is going to happen, and suddenly Magnus Carlsen would have a tremendous amount of pressure on the e4 pawn. So overall, this would have been terrific for black. With that in mind, white here on move 10 does not allow it. He simply takes on e6, by far the best move. And in case you're wondering, this move d takes e6 in this line with the bishop on e2 and e3, this is almost always the right move from white's perspective in these lines. So d takes e6 played in the game. Now Magnus recaptures with the f-pawn, and here Jeffrey decides to immediately start putting pressure on the black position. He jumps forward with the knight to the g5 square. Of course, the knight on g5 is now simply attacking that hanging pawn on e6. You cannot allow knight takes e6, forking both the rook and the queen. That would be an absolute disaster. So with that in mind, queen e7 played by Magnus, by far the best move. I mean, how else are you going to defend that pawn on the e6 square? The rook has to stay on f8. Maybe you could go knight to b8, rerouting to c6, but that is a very, very slow plan. Overall, queen e7 by far the best move here. Now from here, Jeffrey simply castles on the king side, not a very hard move to find. And now from here, Magnus Carlsen, he really needs to find a good plan ASAP. I mean, how is he going to get his bishop on c8 into the game, and where is his counterplay going to come from? Now, I spent a lot of time analyzing this exact position, and it turns out Black has a really tough choice. I mean, there aren't very many good moves for him here, and it turns out Magnus played the best idea. That is simply b6, intending bishop b7 next, putting pressure on the long diagonal with the bishop. So kudos to Magnus. There were some other ideas that I found. For example, a6 intending b5 as a pawn sacrifice is quite playable. And beyond that, there are some lines where you can go h6, trying to get the knight to go back to the f3 square. Then you go knight to g4, hitting the bishop. And finally, you try to trade on c3 with the bishop, giving white double pawns. Now, personally, not a big fan of either of those plans. I think Magnus Carlsen's idea of simply b6 in this position by far the best. Now, from here, Jeffrey Xiong, bishop to f3. This does reveal the one drawback of Magnus Carlsen's plan with b6. Now, for example, if Black were to waste a move here, let's say, oh, I don't know, a5, then immediately Jeffrey's going to strike in the center with the move e5, and suddenly there is a deadly double attack on the knight on f6 and the rook on a8. And again, even if Black were to go bishop b7 here, that does not solve the problem either. Once again, white simply goes e5 with the double attack, and you might be wondering, wait a minute, what if Black simply takes the pawn or takes the bishop? Bishop takes f3, something like that. Then you play the intermediate move, e takes f6, and suddenly you have the intermediate attack on the queen, and this line is just winning for white. So overall, bishop f3 from Jeffrey, super, super dangerous, and Magnus finds pretty much the only way to defend. That is the somewhat surprising move, rook to b8. I mean, it would have been nice if Magnus could have played a more active move besides rook to b8. The rook was potentially more active on the a-file. However, that was completely necessary in this position. Now from here, Jeffrey, he continues developing, playing very solid classical chess. Queen to c2. The idea is after bishop b7 for Magnus, now he brings the rook into the game on the e1 square, rook to e1, and in this position, I mean, wow, just look at all of Jeffrey's pieces here. The bishops on f3 and e3, the rooks on the e and f files, the knight on g5, the queen supporting the center, the knight ready to jump in as well. Oh man, white has achieved peak centralization here. His position has so much potential. All right, now it is Magnus Carlsen to move. What the heck is he supposed to do here? Well, it turns out it's actually very, very hard for Black to have any sort of plan at all. In the game, he goes for the somewhat passive-looking move, a5, and I gotta be honest, it is hard to blame Magnus for this move here. It is a little bit slow, but Magnus has almost nothing he can do in this position that is productive. Now, in case you're wondering, the computer likes the idea of going h6, trying to force the knight back to the h3 square, and then for some reason, you go knight to h7. Perhaps you're increasing the activity of the bishop and the rook on f8, but overall, this style of play looks so weird to me. So, point being, very, very understandable why Magnus Carlsen in this position on move 15 played a5, trying to gain space on the queen side and kind of waiting for white to show his hand. But already he is in a very difficult position to defend. And now it is Jeffrey Xiong's move in this position as white. And as we mentioned, all of his pieces here are just wonderfully placed. The rooks, the bishops, the knights, the queens, everything is ready to strike. And with that in mind, Jeffrey needs to start thinking about breaking in the center, perhaps with a break like e5 or f5. Now, in this position, before going for it, Jeffrey plays the very good prophylactic move, king to h1, simply getting his king off this open diagonal here before trying to open up the game. However, the computer does show the immediate pawn break, f5, is incredibly strong here. Now, I'm not going to cover this in too much detail. Black has a ton of different decent options to reply. G takes f5 is playable, e takes f5, e5, knight e5. I mean, we don't have time to cover all of these options. If you want to investigate it for yourself, you can. But point being, f5 immediately was playable. Instead, king to h1 on the board from Jeffrey. Now, from here, Magnus Carlsen, once again, it is hard to find a good plan for him. Perhaps that h6 idea from earlier is the best way to go. But instead, knight c5 on the board from Magnus. And here, Jeffrey, he smells blood. He sees it is time to strike. He starts by simply knocking off that knight on the c5 square. Bishop takes c5. And here, Magnus already has a difficult choice. How do you recapture? It turns out the move d takes c5 is a massive strategic mistake. White's simply going to go e5 or f5, and he is just dominating the game. So with that in mind, instead of d takes c5, b takes c5 played in the game, by far the best move. But once again, Jeffrey Xiong simply striking in the center of the board with the move f5. He is 100% ready for this move, and this is where shit really hits the fan. All right, now, Magnus Carlsen, what the heck are you supposed to do here as black? Well, first of all, taking that pawn on f5 is not going to be a good idea. For example, e takes f5, e takes f5, and suddenly white has a discovered attack on the queen. The bishop's being attacked. There are just so many different threats here for black. So going back, the same basic thing happens after g takes f5. Not a good move. You're opening up the game too much. Now, the computer here, it loves the idea of simply sacrificing the pawn on e6. And the way you do that is you first go knight to d7. The idea is after knight takes e6, rook to f7. Turns out black actually has a somewhat playable position here. I mean, yes, he is down a pawn, but for now, he is staying alive. And I'm sure Magnus Carlsen could have worked out a way to come back from here. But instead, in the game, Magnus, he makes a major strategic error. He plays the move e5. Now, this move is simply locks down the center, and this is not a good idea for Magnus when he has those two bishops. I mean, look at both of these bishops just biting on granite right now. And yes, technically, white's bishop on f3, not exactly a superstar piece either, but white's knights are going to be rock stars here. All right, now, of course, Jeffrey is to move. He just jumps in with the knight to the e6 square. Very good move, very solid. And now that knight on e6 is probably the strongest piece in the position. I mean, that knight has just achieved a power level of over 9,000. And if you got that Dragon Ball Z reference, hats off to you, my friend. Now here, Magnus, of course, the rook is being attacked on f8, rook to f7 on the board. And now Jeffrey, he sees the essence of the position. He strikes on the king side with the move g4. Oh boy, here we go. You know it's going to be a good game when you see g4 on the board against Magnus Carlsen. All right, obviously the threat here is simply g5, gaining more space on the king side, and if black doesn't react, the follow-up move is going to be f6, forking simply everything in the black position. Now from here, Magnus, he does see this. He simply takes on f5, and now, quick point, white has to find the right way to recapture. Now, the most common way, if you're a beginner, you might be thinking, oh, I got to recapture towards the center with the g-pawn. G takes f5. Well, it turns out this move is way, way weaker. Yes, white is still better. White still has the open g-file to attack. However, Jeffrey's move in the game, e takes f5, is even stronger. As you can see, white now has these two pawns on the king side that can be like basically battery rams just launching down the board. And Magnus Carlsen is going to have his work cut out for him trying to stop those pawns, especially in a blitz game. Now from here, Magnus, he starts by taking that bishop on the f3 square. Bishop takes f3, rook takes f3. And of course, that combination did remove the bishop on f3 that was defending the g4 pawn. And Magnus just jumps in and takes it on g4. However, not a big deal. Here, Jeffrey Xiong simply takes control of the g-file, and already this is looking so bad for Magnus. Okay, from here, Magnus, he fights to defend. He finds the best idea, queen to h4, activating the queen on the very good h4 square, of course, supporting the knight, and also in some lines, threatening queen takes h2 checkmate, so Jeffrey Xiong is going to have to be closely guarding that. Now from here, Jeffrey, queen to g2, piling up pressure on the g-file and that knight on the g4 square, and Magnus responds with h5, trying to support the knight. However, once again, this was a massive strategic mistake. Back in this position, Magnus Carlsen had to find the move e4, sacrificing a pawn. Now, why is that move so important? Well, first of all, Magnus in the game played h5, but then Jeffrey Xiong jumps in with the knight, knight to e4, and suddenly white is just dominating the entire board. I mean, look at that bishop on the g7 square. What the heck is this supposed to be doing here? Now, if we go back in time, back to this position right here, before the move h5 from Magnus, why is e4 so good and so necessary for Magnus? Well, e4, this is technically not a pawn sacrifice, and here's why. If Jeffrey were to take on e4 with the knight, then Magnus suddenly opens up the line of attack with the bishop on b2, and that means rook takes b2, is an extremely strong move, hitting the queen, supported by the bishop, and oh man, Magnus would be taking over the initiative here. So of course, knight takes e4, not the move. Instead here, you have to go rook to f4, and only then the key move for black is going to be h5. And the difference here is that the pawn is already on e4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, and that means if white ever goes knight takes e4, then bang, rook takes b2 on the board, supported by the bishop, hitting the queen, and Magnus is going to have a great game. But instead of that, h5 on the board right away, knight e4. Jeffrey Xiong does not miss his opportunity to simply lock down the position. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen's position just goes from bad to worse. He has 14 seconds on the clock from here, and he starts by taking the pawn on h2 with the knight. This leads to a bunch of trades, and it doesn't turn out super well for Magnus. I mean, in the end, after this big combination, Jeffrey Xiong ends up being up an entire piece. I mean, yes, Magnus does have 2 pawns for the piece. However, his king is still in grave danger on the g8 square. Let's see what happens from here. Rook to f1. Magnus putting pressure on the king. And he retreats, but now Jeffrey Xiong jumps in with the finishing blow of the game. Knight to f6 check. Oh my goodness, look at this. The rook on h2 cutting off the h-file. This knight cutting off f8. The only thing black can do here, again, the bishop being pinned too, the only thing he can do is rook takes f6, and then rook takes g7 is checkmate. Oh my goodness, what a mating attack. And for that reason, in this position, after the move, knight to f6, Magnus Carlsen resigns on this spot to Jeffrey Xiong. Wow, what an incredible game by both players. Now before you go, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.